What if I told you that south of Egypt, beyond the first cataract of Nile, there existed a kingdom so powerful that it would one day rule over the land of the Pharaohs? A kingdom of gold, skilled archers, and a culture as complex and advanced as Egypt itself? This was Nubia, known in history as the Kingdom of Kush. Long before Nubian kings claimed the Egyptian throne, this land had already seen centuries of civilization. Archaeologists have uncovered bustling cities like Kerma, where people crafted exquisite pottery, worked metals, and built sophisticated homes. Their temples, their burials, their everyday artifacts all speak of society that was remarkably advanced, uniquely African, and more than just Egypt's southern neighbor. The Egyptians themselves called it Taseti, the land of the bow, honoring Nubian archers whose skill on the battlefield was legendary. They also called it Nub, the land of gold, because the wealth of this kingdom flowed northward into Egypt for centuries. But the relationship between Egypt and Nubia was never simple. Trade, cultural exchange, intermarriage, and occasional conflict shaped centuries along the Nile. By 1500 BCE, during Egypt's new kingdom, the balance of power shifted. Drawn by Nubia's wealth, its gold, its trade routes, Egypt conquered much of Kush, turning it into a colonial territory. For centuries, Nubian resources fueled Egyptian armies and monuments. Yet, conquest was never complete. In towns and temples along the Nile, Nubian tradition survived. They learned Egyptian hieroglyphs, adopted religious practices, and studied the rituals of kingship, all while preserving their own language, culture, and identity. Then came a turning point. Around 1070 BCE, Egypt's new kingdom began to crumble. Rebellions, foreign invasions, and economic troubles weakened its hold over the south. The Kushites saw opportunity. They didn't just rebuild, they began to claim the mantle of Egyptian legitimacy itself. The secret to their audacity? Religion, culture, and politics. At the heart of it was Jebel Barkal, a towering sandstone peak in northern Nubia. Here, the Kushites believed the god Ammonius had been born. It became the spiritual center of their rising power. Around 760 BCE, a king named Pi rose in Nepeta, a city near Jebel Barkal. He combined military strategy, religious authority, and political intelligence in a way no one had seen before. Egypt at the time was fractured. Libyan rulers controlled the north. Local chieftains held sway over cities. Pi didn't see himself as a mere conqueror. He presented himself as a restorer of Egypt, a guardian of Ma'at, the cosmic order that governed life. He adopted Egyptian titles, performed Egyptian rituals, and presented his rule as legitimate, not foreign. When Pi marched north, many cities submitted without a fight. Those who resisted faced Kushite armies, disciplined and deadly with their bows. By 728 BCE, Pi controlled Egypt from Nubia to the Mediterranean. An African king had conquered Egypt and been accepted as its pharaoh. Yet Pi's genius didn't end there. Instead of moving the capital to Memphis or Thebes, he ruled Egypt from afar, keeping Nepeta as his base. Local officials governed the cities, maintaining Egyptian administration, while Kush remained independent. This dual governance model became the hallmark of the 25th dynasty. The Kushites weren't just rulers, they were custodians of culture. Temples were restored, art and craft flourished, and in Nubia, pyramids reappeared, built with distinct Kushite features, steeper angles, underground chambers, and decorative motifs unique to the region. Pilgrims traveled to Jebel Barkal to honor the divine authority of these pharaohs. The story of Nubia is one of resilience, a civilization that survived centuries of Egyptian domination and emerged stronger, blending Egyptian knowledge with its own culture, cities, and systems of trade. By the end of this chapter, one thing is clear. Nubia was no footnote in history. It was a cradle of civilization, a power that shaped Egypt's destiny, and a kingdom whose legacy was almost forgotten until today. The story of Nubia's rise would reach its dramatic turning point with Pi's campaign into Egypt. By 744 BCE, the land of the Pharaohs was fractured and vulnerable. Competing dynasties had splintered the once mighty new kingdom. Libyan rulers controlled the delta, while local city-states acted as independent powers. Egypt was rich in resources, steeped in history, and weakened by internal strife. a tempting prize for a foreign king who claimed both divine right and military skill. But Pi, later known as Pianki, understood that conquest alone would not secure Egypt. Military might was only one part of the equation. To truly rule, he needed legitimacy, religious, cultural, and political. And for this, he turned to the sacred mountain of Jebel Barkal, the heart of Nubian spiritual power. The Kushite pharaohs believed that by aligning themselves with the god Ammonius, they could claim authority not just over Nubia, but over all of Egypt. The campaign began with careful planning. Pi's forces were disciplined and expertly trained, blending traditional Nubian archery with tactics adapted from Egyptian warfare. Each step was calculated. His armies moved methodically north along the Nile, securing towns and strategic points, always presenting themselves as restorers of Ma'at, the ancient Egyptian principle of cosmic order. They were not invaders but guardians, returning Egypt to its rightful path. City after city fell to Pi's authority. Many rulers, recognizing his divine mandate and military strength, surrendered without resistance. Those who resisted faced the Kushite armies, renowned for precision and discipline. The conquest was swift, strategic, and often bloodless, an achievement that surprised the contemporary world. By 728 BCE, Pi had unified Egypt under Nubian rule, a feat unmatched in history. Yet Pi's genius extended beyond battlefield victories. Rather than establishing a permanent court in Egypt's capitals, he maintained his seat of power in Napata, Nubia, ruling Egypt through appointed officials. This dual governance model was revolutionary. It allowed Nubia to remain independent while exercising authority over a foreign land, a delicate balance that required diplomatic skill, cultural understanding, and unwavering strategic vision. The implications of this conquest were profound. Nubian rule was not destructive. It was restorative. Under Pi, neglected temples were repaired, statues of forgotten deities restored, and religious ceremonies reinvigorated. The Kushites respected Egyptian traditions, blending them seamlessly with their own cultural practices. Egyptian scribes were employed to record events. Craftsmen were commissioned to build monuments, and temples became centers of both worship and political influence. The architectural achievements of this period reveal the sophistication of Nubian influence. Pyramids reappeared in Nubia, constructed with steep angles and underground chambers distinct from Egyptian prototypes. Jebel Barkal became a central pilgrimage site, symbolizing the divine authority of Kushite kings. The integration of Egyptian and Nubian traditions created a unique cultural synthesis, a civilization that was African yet unmistakably Egyptian in its legitimacy and grandeur. But conquest was only the beginning. The real challenge lay in sustaining control. Egypt, fractured and historically resistant to foreign rule, required constant attention. Pi's successors would need to navigate internal dissent, manage diplomatic relations with neighboring states, and defend against external threats. The 25th dynasty, born of Nubian ambition and strategic brilliance, will be tested in ways that would define its legacy. One of Pi's most remarkable achievements was the careful preservation of knowledge and culture. Unlike other conquerors who imposed new systems, Pi ensured continuity. Libraries were maintained, temples preserved, and religious practices codified. The Kushites understood that power was not merely in armies, but in culture, faith, and administration. By merging Nubian innovation with Egyptian tradition, they created a dynasty that commanded respect, loyalty, and awe. Yet, the conquest also exposed the vulnerabilities of this new order. While Pi had succeeded through a combination of military and religious legitimacy, future pharaohs would face threats from both within and beyond Egypt's borders. Rival dynasties, rebellious governors, and foreign powers such as the Assyrians loomed on the horizon. Maintaining control required constant vigilance, strategic alliances, and the ability to adapt to changing circumstances. Despite these challenges, the Kushite rulers left an indelible mark. They demonstrated that African kingdoms could not only survive but thrive, influencing regions far beyond their borders. Nubian governance integrated diplomacy, religion, and military strategy in ways that even Egyptian rulers had rarely achieved. They revived classical Egyptian art, refined hieroglyphic writing, and expanded trade networks that connected Egypt, Nubia, and sub-Saharan Africa. Trade flourished under Kushite rule. Gold, Ivory, exotic animals, and luxury goods flowed north along the Nile, while Egyptian products and technologies moved south. Nubia became a hub of cultural exchange, a crossroads where ideas, art, and knowledge traveled freely. This economic and cultural vitality strengthened the 25th dynasty, ensuring that their rule was not merely tolerated but respected. The conquest of Egypt by Pi and the Kushites was a turning point in African history. For centuries, Egypt had been seen as a pinnacle of civilization, a land of wealth, knowledge, and power. Yet it was now ruled by kings from the south, whose legitimacy was rooted not in conquest alone, but in mastery of religion, culture, and diplomacy. The world had underestimated Nubia, and it would take centuries for historians to fully recognize the magnitude of this achievement. Pi's campaign also set the stage for his successors, who would face even greater challenges. The Assyrian Empire, expanding westward, would test the limits of Nubian military strategy and diplomacy. Internal unrest and external pressures would require a combination of innovation, leadership, and foresight. But the foundation laid by Pi, an empire governed with legitimacy, intelligence, and cultural synthesis, would enable the Kushite dynasty to endure and leave a legacy that continues to fascinate historians today. In retrospect, the conquest of Egypt was more than a military triumph. It was a testament to strategic brilliance, cultural understanding, and visionary leadership. Pi and the Kushites demonstrated that African kingdoms could influence and shape civilizations far beyond their borders, blending power with legitimacy in a way that was both sophisticated and sustainable. As Egypt fragmented into competing dynasties, the kingdom of Kush was quietly preparing to step onto history's grand stage. The collapse of central authority in Egypt after the new kingdom created a power vacuum, and it was from the southern land, often overlooked by historians, that a remarkable resurgence would emerge. The people of Kush had long observed Egypt, learning its customs, studying its religion, and mastering the arts of kingship. For centuries, Nubian princes and nobles had served in Egyptian armies, brought Egyptian goods home, and sent ambassadors to the Nile's northern cities. Yet now, with Egypt weakened, Kushite leaders saw an opportunity not just to reclaim independence, but to assert themselves as legitimate rulers of the entire Nile Valley. The stage was set around 760 BC, when a visionary ruler named Pi, or Pi, as some records call him, rose in Apeta, a city revered as a spiritual heart of Kush. Archaeological evidence suggests that Pi was more than a military strategist. He was a statesman, a deeply religious man, and a student of Egyptian culture. His goal was audacious: to unify Egypt under Kushite rule, but not merely as conquerors. He intended to restore Ma'at, the sacred principle of cosmic order and justice, to a land fractured by rival dynasties. Pi's approach was methodical, rather than rushing into battle. He relied on diplomacy, alliances, and projection of religious legitimacy. Local rulers who acknowledged him were confirmed in their positions. Those who resisted faced the might of Kushite armies. These forces were famed for their archery skills, disciplined formations, and adaptability. By around 728 BC, Pi had consolidated control from Nubia to the Nile Delta, marking the first time an African ruler had united Egypt in centuries. What made Pi exceptional was his understanding of Egyptian tradition. Unlike many foreign conquerors, he did not impose Kushite customs on Egypt. Instead, he demonstrated mastery over Egyptian religious rites, artistic styles, and administrative systems. Inscriptions from his reign reveal careful attention to Egyptian royal titles and ceremonial practices, signaling to the people that he was not an outsider, but the rightful heir to the pharaonic legacy. Yet Pi's genius was not only in conquest, it was in governance. Rather than establishing permanent residence in Memphis or Thebes, he returned to Napata, administering Egypt through appointed officials while maintaining his power base in Kush. This dual kingship model, unprecedented in the ancient world, allowed him to maintain control while preserving Kushite independence and identity. Under Pi's leadership, Egypt began to see a revival. Neglected temples were restored, artistic quality soared, and the administrative apparatus of pharaohs regained efficiency. Meanwhile, in Nubia, Pi and his successors constructed new pyramids at Nuri and other sites, blending Egyptian architectural techniques with local innovations. Steeper angles, underground burial chambers, and decorative motifs that reflected Kushite artistic traditions. The religious implications of Pi's reign were profound. Jebel Barkal, a sandstone mountain considered sacred by the Kushites, became a pilgrimage site for priests and devotees from across the Nile Valley. Egyptian religious authorities traveled south to consult oracles and participate in ceremonies, solidifying the divine legitimacy of Kushite rulers. Here, Kushite kings were not only political leaders, but also spiritual intermediaries, bridging two great civilizations through faith and ritual. Following Pi, Shabaka ascended the throne around 721 BC. Unlike his predecessor, Shabaka resided primarily in Egypt, establishing a more conventional pharaonic court while maintaining close ties to Nubia. His reign coincided with the rise of the Assyrian Empire, a formidable power threatening Egypt's stability. Egyptian cities and vassal states appealed to Shabaka for military support, marking the first test of Kushite leadership against an external superpower. But it was during the reign of Taharqa, who came to power around 690 BC, that the Kushite dynasty reached its apex. Taharqa was a visionary leader, a military strategist, and a cultural innovator. He inherited an Egypt under siege, with Assyrian armies advancing from the north and discontent brewing among local elites. Yet Taharqa's preparation was meticulous. He studied Assyrian tactics, reformed Kushite armies, and combined traditional archery skills with new military technologies. Taharqa understood that victory required more than force. He established an intelligence network that spanned Egypt and the Near East, gathering information on troop movements, political alliances, and economic vulnerabilities. Kushite agents operated in the Assyrian Empire, coordinating rebellions and resistance movements, creating a strategic web that extended across 3 continents. Taharqa's brilliance lay in blending diplomacy, economic influence, and culture with military innovation, a comprehensive approach to leadership that few in history could rival. In 701 BC, the Assyrians besieged Jerusalem, prompting Taharqa to march north in support of King Hezekiah of Judah. The ensuing confrontation ended in disaster for the Assyrians, whose armies retreated due to strategic miscalculations, disease, or the coordination on multiple fronts. Taharqa's victory cemented his reputation as one of the great military leaders of the ancient world. But Taharqa did not stop at military achievement. He embarked on an ambitious cultural renaissance. Temples at Karnak were expanded, urban centers revitalized, and trade networks extended across Africa. Craftsmen and artisans flourished under Kushite patronage, producing works that combined Egyptian traditions with Kushite aesthetics. Hieroglyphic inscriptions reached new heights of grammatical precision, reflecting a conscious effort to preserve and restore classical Egyptian knowledge. Economically, Taharqa transformed Egypt and Kush into a thriving network of trade and industry. Gold, ivory, exotic animals, and manufactured goods flowed north from Kushite territories, while Egyptian technologies and products moved south into previously untapped markets. Cities prospered, and international merchants returned, recognizing the stability and opportunity under Kushite rule. Taharqa also prioritized education and preservation. Scholars were commissioned to record Egyptian religious texts, historical documents, and technical knowledge, ensuring the survival of cultural heritage. Libraries, temple archives, and administrative records were carefully maintained, leaving a legacy of intellectual achievement that would outlast the dynasty itself. Through skillful governance, military genius, and cultural stewardship, the Kushite pharaohs demonstrated that African civilizations could not only compete but surpass the achievements of more widely recognized powers. Their rule was not a brief interlude. It was a transformative period that redefined the Nile Valley. Yet even as they consolidated power, the Kushites faced formidable challenges. Political intrigue, foreign threats, and the ambitions of Assyrian and Libyan forces tested their resilience. But through strategic foresight and the blending of traditions, the Kushite dynasty not only survived but thrived, leaving an indelible mark on history. The rise of the Kushite pharaohs teaches us that leadership is not solely about conquest. It is about vision, cultural understanding, and the ability to unify disparate peoples under a shared sense of purpose. Pi, Shabaka, and Taharqa exemplified this rare combination, reshaping Egypt while preserving the soul of Kush. As we move forward to the next chapter, we will explore how the Kushite dynasty maintained its influence in Egypt, how they faced their greatest challenges, and how their innovative governance models shaped the political and cultural landscape of Africa for centuries to come. The story of the Kushite pharaohs is not just a tale of conquest. It is a testament to the enduring power of vision, diplomacy, and cultural synthesis, a lesson that continues to resonate in the study of ancient civilizations. By the time the Kushite pharaohs secured control over Egypt, they stood at the height of their power. The Nile Valley, once fragmented, unstable, and threatened by foreign ambitions, was now under the authority of Dynasty that had risen from the deserts of Nubia. Yet the same forces that brought the Kushites to power would soon challenge their very existence. Chapter 4 is a story of survival adaptation and the golden age that emerged despite looming threats. The Kushite dynasty had unified Egypt through a rare combination of diplomacy, cultural understanding, and military prowess. But ruling Egypt was never a simple task. The North and South had always differed in language, culture, priorities, and loyalties. Egyptian elites had accepted the Kushites because they restored stability, but beneath the surface, rival dynasties, ambitious generals, and rebellious governors waited for their chance. Shabaka, Pi's successor, understood this better than anyone. Unlike Pi, who ruled Egypt from the safety of Napata and Nubia, Shabaka made Egypt his true seat of power. He moved the political center back into the heart of the Nile Valley, restoring traditional temples, reinforcing administrative structures, and bringing a sense of renewed unity. But Shabaka faced a threat that no Egyptian dynasty had ever encountered at this scale: the Assyrian Empire. While the Kushite pharaohs restored order in Egypt, Assyria was expanding aggressively into Levant and Mesopotamia. They had advanced military engineering, iron weaponry, and siege capabilities unmatched in the region. Their king sought wealth, territory, and dominance, and Egypt was the ultimate prize. At first, the Kushites tried diplomacy. Envoys, gifts, and subtle negotiations were sent northward, hoping to buy time to delay the inevitable confrontation. But Assyria was not a kingdom content with peace. Their ambition stretched across continents, and Egypt represented both strategic and symbolic value. The first clashes began in the northern territories. Small Egyptian outposts, loyal to the Kushite dynasty, were attacked or pressured into submission. Local governors wavered between loyalty to the pharaohs and fear of the Assyrian war machine. For the first time since Pi's conquest, the unity of Egypt was slipping. Then came Taharqa. When he rose to the throne around 690 BCE, the Nile Valley needed more than a ruler. It needed a defender. Taharqa's leadership was defined by war strategy and a deep commitment to protecting the land his ancestors had unified. He restructured the military, increasing the use of Kushite archers, reinforcing chariot units, and integrating newly adopted tactics to counter Assyrian siege warfare. He strengthened coastal defenses, improved intelligence networks, and established alliances across the region, especially with kingdoms resisting Assyrian expansion. But Taharqa also understood that a kingdom must stand strong not only in war, but also in culture. He launched a massive campaign of temple building and restoration throughout Egypt. Karnak, Thebes, and Memphis flourished again. In Nubia, new pyramids were constructed and artistic expression reached a new height, blending the best of Egyptian tradition with the unique identity of Kush. This period is often called the Kushite Golden Age. Cities prospered. Trade routes stretching into Central Africa brought gold, ivory, ebony, and exotic animals into the heart of the Nile Valley. Egyptian craftsmanship revived with fresh inspiration. Priests held elaborate ceremonies at Jebel Barkal, reinforcing the spiritual authority of the dynasty. And for a brief moment, Egypt felt united, confident, and renewed under an African dynasty that honored its traditions while charting its own path. Yet the shadow of Assyria only grew larger. By 671 BCE, Assyrian armies marched directly into Egypt. Their invasion was brutal, efficient, and relentless. Cities fell one by one, some resisting fiercely, others surrendering in fear. Taharqa personally led counterattacks, using the terrain of the Nile and the endurance of his Kushite soldiers to slow the advance. There were victories, moments when Taharqa's strategies forced Assyrian retreats or stalled their supply lines. But Assyria's resources were overwhelming. They had siege engines capable of breaching fortified walls, iron weapons against which bronze armor stood little chance, and armies hardened by decades of constant warfare. Eventually, Memphis fell. The loss was devastating, Politically, symbolically, emotionally, Taharqa retreated south, regrouping in Thebes and continued resistance, but the Assyrian advance was unstoppable. They installed loyal governors, executed rebels, and attempted to erase Kushite influence, but they could not erase the loyalty of the south. Even as the Assyrians controlled parts of Lower Egypt, Upper Egypt and Nubia remained loyal to the sons of Kush. Taharqa continued his fight, regaining territories, mobilizing armies, and inspiring local populations to resist. His reign became a symbol of resilience, a king who refused to surrender even when the world's mightiest empire pressed against him. After Taharqa's death, his successor Tanemani continued the struggle. For a brief moment, he recaptured Memphis and restored Kushite control. But Assyria struck back with overwhelming force, pushing the Kushite dynasty out of Egypt entirely by 656 BCE. At first glance, it seems like defeat, but history tells a different story. Despite losing Egypt, the kingdom of Kush did not collapse. Instead, it retreated southward to Nepeta and later to Meroe, entering another era of cultural richness, innovation, and political power. The Kushites preserved their identity, expanded trade deeper into Africa, and continued building pyramids and monuments that still stand today. Their rule over Egypt, though lasting less than a century, left an impact that shaped the region for generations. They restored ancient temples, revived classical art, protected sacred traditions, and united Egypt during one of the darkest periods in its history. The Kushites proved that African civilizations were sophisticated, strategic, and capable of ruling one of the world's greatest empires. But the challenges they faced, from internal divisions to foreign empires, revealed the harsh realities of ancient geopolitics. Power was never secure, territory was always contested, and survival depended on both strength and wisdom. The Kushite dynasty story is not one of failure. It is a story of endurance, a story of a kingdom that rose from the deserts of Nubia, restored Egypt's glory, defended its lands with unmatched courage, and then retreated, not in destruction but in dignity, carrying its legacy southward. As we move into the next chapter, we will explore the transformation of Kush after Egypt, how a kingdom once defined by conquest reinvented itself as a thriving African empire, shaping the cultural and political landscape of the continent for centuries. The story of the Kushite pharaohs does not end with conquest or battles. It continues in a lasting impact they left on both Egypt and Nubia, in culture, governance, and the very identity of Africa itself. By the time the 25th dynasty waned, the Kushites had proven that vision, diplomacy, and cultural adaptation could rival brute military power. Their legacy is not just historical. It is a blueprint for leadership that resonates even today. After Taharqa, the final rulers of the Kushite dynasty faced mounting challenges. Assyria remained a looming threat, pushing Egypt back toward fragmentation. Internal strife, economic pressure, and the sheer difficulty of ruling a land so vast and diverse made the dynasty vulnerable. Yet even in decline, Kushite influence persisted. The strategies, alliances, and systems they created endured, long after their direct control faded. One of the most enduring legacies was architecture and cultural synthesis. The Kushites had introduced pyramids in Nubia with designs distinct from Egypt's, steep, elegant, and uniquely African. Temples and tombs reflected a fusion of Egyptian hieroglyphics and Nubian iconography, blending two civilizations into a lasting artistic expression. Across the Nile, monumental constructions at Karnak, Nepeta, and Meroe stood as testaments to their vision, reminding future generations that cultural identity could survive even conquest and exile. In governance, the Kushites demonstrated innovation that few empires in history achieved. Their bicultural administration, ruling Egypt while maintaining Nubian roots, allowed them to balance local traditions with centralized authority. They integrated local elites into governance, respected religious customs, and encouraged economic growth. By doing so, they secured loyalty not through fear alone, but through inclusion and shared prosperity. This approach influenced later African kingdoms, from Aksum in Ethiopia to West African empires centuries later, providing a model for sustainable leadership. Religion, too, bore their mark. By centering authority around Ammonius of Jebel Barkal, the Kushite pharaohs legitimized their rule while preserving spiritual continuity. Temples in the Peda became centers of learning and pilgrimage, blending Egyptian and Nubian traditions. Priests were trained to serve both communities, ensuring that religion remained a unifying rather than divisive force. This strategic use of faith as both cultural glue and political tool demonstrated a level of statecraft that was rare in the ancient world. Economically, Kush thrived even after losing direct control of Egypt. Trade networks established during their rule connected Nubia to Egypt, the Red Sea, and sub-Saharan Africa. Gold, ivory, exotic animals, and luxury goods flowed along these routes, enriching the kingdom and allowing it to maintain influence. The city of Meroe emerged as a vibrant center of commerce, iron production, and learning, carrying forward the Kushite tradition of innovation and economic foresight. The Kushite dynasty also left a legacy in military strategy. Their disciplined archers, combined arms tactics, and understanding of regional geography were studied and emulated for centuries. Even after Assyrian invasions forced Kushite withdrawal, their defensive strategies informed later African and Egyptian military thought. The Kushites had shown that smaller kingdoms, when well-led and strategically minded, could challenge and even temporarily subdue the mightiest empires of their time. Yet the most profound legacy of the Kushites is perhaps symbolic and psychological. They proved that African civilizations could rise, govern, and innovate on their own terms. In a world often dominated by Mediterranean and Near Eastern narratives, the Kushites stood as a reminder that Africa was not a passive recipient of history. It was a creator, a shaper, and a preserver of culture and governance. Historical records, inscriptions, and archaeological discoveries allow us to trace their influence long after the dynasty itself faded. Kings and queens of later Nubian kingdoms invoked Kushite titles, emulated their religious practices, and built pyramids in tribute to this lineage. The very idea of African rulership, capable of uniting diverse peoples and maintaining cultural identity while expanding influence, owes much to the vision of the Kushite pharaohs. The story of the 25th dynasty, from Pa to Hark and beyond, teaches a timeless lesson. Leadership is measured not just in conquest, but in vision, resilience, and the ability to leave behind structures, political, cultural, and spiritual, that outlast a lifetime. The Kushites mastered this lesson, blending pragmatism with idealism, and leaving an indelible mark on history. Their rise, consolidation, cultural achievements, and eventual decline form a narrative that resonates today. For students of history, they provide insight into the dynamics of empire, the power of diplomacy and cultural synthesis, and the ways in which leadership can endure beyond its immediate temporal power. For Africa, the Kushites stand as a source of pride, a civilization that shaped the Nile, protected its people, and left a blueprint for governance that would inspire generations. As we conclude the story of the Kushite pharaohs, we are reminded that history is not merely a record of who conquered whom, but of ideas, strategies, and legacies. The 25th dynasty story echoes through time, showing that with vision, cultural respect, and strategic foresight, even a kingdom south of the Nile could rise to shape the destiny of an entire continent.